Yeah, I guess we can just say welcome to the. I don't know. Do we agree on the name yet?
Yeah, yeah.
Or
Let's. I mean, we can always rebrand, so it's like we don't
yeah, yeah,
have to
sure.
like it's not a big deal. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, we'll start with leaving the past, and I mean, it's a good name for now. And it has
Hmm.
like, I mean, people like these like concepts of hope and stuff. So it's like it almost sounds like a hopeful message for the future. It's like, yeah, that past, it's in my past, and I'm ready to move on for something better. Like people love
And
these
I'm
kind of
leaving
comments. I
it.
don't know. Yeah, 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 exactly. I think reality is a better antidote to problems than hope, but that's me. But but that's a whole other story. But either way, yeah, I think it's a good name. I think yeah, this is what we want to convey. Like you want something that like people see it and like they're like, okay, this like they're critical, but they also offer like opportunity. Like they offer like paths to solutions and stuff like this. Like we're not just being like, yeah, it sucks, it sucks, it sucks, it sucks, right?
Oh,
Like
there's some kind of constructive element as well, right?
yeah, of course. But I think that's the only way. It's like I mean, of course, like if no one listens to you, yeah, of course, your message can only go so far. But like the idea is you want to grow a following, and I think growing that following on a positive message works. And then like as the following grows, then actually you can have like some level of impact that you actually want to see. So I think those things are important.
But it's interesting how you say it's a positive note, right? Because for me, it's not only hope, but it's also some kind of aggression and forward movement, which
Yeah,
I like about it. But it's also something that we don't have to dwell too much about. And I agree, like we can always change the name, right? It doesn't really matter.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Agreed, agreed.
All right. Should we say a few words about who we are?
Yeah, yeah.
You want to go
You want
first?
to go ahead? I can go ahead. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. My name is Jared. I'm from the East Coast, and my political awakening, so to speak, came from the beginning of the Iraq War, where we went into war on false pretenses. And even when I was a child, I think I was around. Yeah, I was really young when the Iraq War happened. And I was thinking, I was like, what's going on? Like, what's the purpose of all this? And my dad was a pretty committed. Skeptic of the U.S. government for quite good reasons. And he told me, he said, this war is a bunch of garbage and they're lying. And I was like, well, how do you know, right? And he was like, you'll see. And because they didn't provide any evidence and this kind of thing, and I was too young to understand like these concepts of like evidentiary standards and stuff. So he was like, yeah, you'll see. And then lo and behold, a couple years later, the CIA came out with their autopsy on the Iraq invasion, and they said, yeah, well, looks like we went in and we never had any, solid evidence, even though Colin Powell was saying this and Washington Post was saying that, etc. And then that I think that has largely colored my view on politics, and I think I've kind of grown into my adult political beliefs through that lens and through the lens of like I guess just finding truth and understanding. Of course, I have an ideology, but at the same time, like understanding the actual reality of what's happening and trying to sort through the junk and really trying to understand what's happening.
I think it's a good way to put it. And it's just yeah, I don't want to dwell again too much on it because we have stuff to talk about, right? But it's
Of
a really
course.
really interesting era to grow up in and to begin your political being because there's so many nuances and so many elements of you talk about truth, right? And how you get to that truth. It really becomes complicated, especially in relation to the whole Iraq war and who do you listen to and who don't you listen to. I think that was an eye opener for a lot of people. And in many ways, I think it's also like kind of the modern era's foundation of this whole like fake news and everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, all right. So my name is Rasmus, and I'm from I don't know. I'm not really from like any coast, right? I'm from Harskov, a small city in like northern Zealand, whatever. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I've always been interested in politics and always been interested in philosophy also, and social science in general. And yeah, that's also most of what I work with and do relates to that. So yeah, I'm just excited for us to talk today and talk about U.S. politics, international politics, Danish politics, and yeah, all the things around that as well, and
Yeah.
how it all connects. And if we should maybe especially because this is like the first episode, we should maybe take a second to just address like what it is that we would like to do with this podcast, or maybe we should just show it and don't tell it. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, maybe I think maybe showing it will tell it over time. I think I think this this place that we come from, this seeking truth mindset and this kind of thing, it'll kind of color the lens through which people view what we say, and then at the same time, I think it'll become clear over time, like kind of the shape the podcast takes, that and then we can go into it more, like if we have develop more of a routine, we can start introducing the routine and this kind of thing. But if we have more scattered but still focused on central issue, that could also be how things happen. So I think
sounds good. I guess for me it's just there's an element to this where it's also about really holding on brutally and honestly to that truth that we see, that so often gets distorted or bent or adjusted to interests in corporate and public news, that hopefully we can have a different discussion around, and try to hopefully be able to bring into the mainstream some of the views that are more independent. And I guess today we're talking about the US election and stuff around that, both looking into what's going to come with the Biden presidency, and also looking into the election itself, and then kind of doing I like the way you described it in the notes for today's episode, which is like the autopsy of the Trump presidency, which is definitely an interesting discussion. And there is it's kind of like a liminal moment right now. I think like we're in this weird in between phase with kind of no Trump and kind of no Biden. But still, they both are present, and things are probably not going to be the same than before Trump. And it's just it's an interesting moment right now, I think. But you kind of wanted to start with the general introduction to the going a bit back in history to the 2000 election, and maybe do you want to speak about that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And in case you want to leave some space for talking about what's going on in Denmark, just let me know if you want to talk about that first as well.
Yeah, sure. We can talk about that first, actually. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
The Mink case.
Yeah, tell me your thoughts, and I guess what you know. I'm probably not as well versed as you are, so.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, and just to get to context, like we talked about, we would like to maybe like as a kind of opening segment have a short discussion around the main news that are going on in Denmark. So the thing that kind of very easily stood out this week or this time at the current moment, especially I think today, where you're seeing Copenhagen, like there's like tractors everywhere. Have you seen it? I'm outside Copenhagen, so
no, I didn't see it. I mean, I haven't really gone anywhere. I've been kind of just chilling, but I saw like there's this Instagram page, Anders Hemmingsen Stako, and and pretty trashy meme page. But anyway, so like they posted a bunch of like they're like riding around on the street, but also like in parking lots, just demonstrating. So that's actually one thing I was kind of curious about. Like, what exactly are the demands? Like, do they want to restart the industry? Do they want like a handout from the government and restart the industry? Do they just want a handout, like, and do something else? Like, I'm not sure what they actually want.
So I'm also not 100% sure, but from one thing I did see though was a quote that they said the government should like call for re-elections, kind of.
So they want to invalidate the government for what they did at home. So.
Yeah, I think that's one of the demands, or at least that's a demand that's been phrased. So I actually kind of think this might blow up bigger than we might expect, and we could see maybe the prime minister leaving. I don't think the chances are big, but I think there's a chance for that happening, because it is kind of just a crazy case. And for those who don't know what happened, is that we had this virus, COVID. I don't know if anybody heard about it, but it's kind of spreading around, also in Denmark, and it also, besides being able to transmit between humans, it also can go from humans to apparently minks, which there is a decent industry in Denmark around mink farming, where they, you know, use the fur. I don't know if it's called mink farming, but they usually use the fur to develop like different accessories and handbags and whatnot. And then the virus mutated, the COVID mutated or like one of these minks got infected, and then it spread in a lot of different mink farms, and you had like a mutation happening in the minks that they were afraid then could go to humans, and then it went to humans, and like there was a few cases where people got sick with another mutation of COVID, and people started getting like super afraid of a new strain of COVID-20 or something starting to spread from Denmark, right? As kind of a new Wuhan epicenter of the world. That was kind of some of the anxiety that arose around that. I'm not a biologist and I don't know the specifics of the virus, but I guess there's reasonable
cluster 5 or something, I believe.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And then we had the unfortunate happening that the government, without kind of like I'm actually not 100% sure on like these like legal terms in English, but they had basically they ordered the government ordered, and the Ministry of Agriculture ordered the mink farmers to kill all the minks, which, you know, is unfortunate, but you know, there's an argument for doing that, considering that there is like a risk of a new spreading and stuff like that. And then what happened was that they then found out magically afterwards that they didn't have the legal means to do that from the ministry. And then in the beginning they started like saying that, you know, it was just guidelines, and they came up with all these like weird excuses that even though they had like written like explicitly in emails and letters to farmers that they should like eliminate all the minks by this and this date and so on, then they turned it around and said it was guidelines and stuff like that. And then there's been different departments that apparently knew and did tell the ministry that, you know, it was kind of illegal what they were doing. Then the Minister of Agriculture, he left, or he was, he resigned, actually left. Yeah, he resigned. And it kind of just keeps going right now. And I think right now they're just trying to push this narrative that it was kind of a mistake.
What is it, like Mogens
Jensen? Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of a mess right now, and it's kind of just I guess a typical case of like in a crisis situation, abuse of power, where I guess one argument that is being made is that, you know, sure, it would maybe it didn't follow the law exactly, but it was the right call, which is kind of a problematic argument, I think, in many ways. Because if you don't have rule of law, even in crisis situations, then what do you have rule of law for? And again, like the question is now, what is going to be the outcome of this, right? How high up is it going to go, and what's going to be the long-term effects of this? And you could go into a lot of larger discussions around the increased or decreased transparency in government in Denmark, which has already started occurring like a couple of years back. With the mørklægnings lovgivning. And, you know, what is going to be the long-term effect of these pandemic laws? In the same way you had, like, I mean, speaking of what you were talking about earlier with the Iraq war and so on, right? With how 9/11 was really like used to push through all of these different, the Patriot Act and so on, like all these different kind of surveillance, lower transparency, so on.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with this author, Naomi Klein. Do you know her?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So she coined this term, the shock doctrine. Basically, anytime. Oh, so you know this? Okay, good.
Yeah.
So just for the record, it's basically anytime there's a time of crisis, just like you were saying, they use it as a reason or an excuse to push forward any type of draconian principle. And sometimes they'll say there's a sunset clause, sometimes they'll say there isn't. But this actually isn't so important. I mean, it's important that they do sunset theoretically, like if you would ever even have an allowance for these kind of policies. But oftentimes, like even if they do sunset, what you have is you have the government now understands how to wield this power better. They know how to like utilize this power and implement it more quickly, and then so they can do these things obviously extrajudicially, which they in America have done, on countless instances. Then they also have, more latitude to like to change laws slowly to allow these things to kind of creep into the permanent legal framework over time. And that's actually what's happening in America. So it's like there's a lot of things that happen extrajudicially that they just, there's no accountability for, but then there's also things that are happening within the legal system. And a lot of these judges are actually providing a legal framework for these things to actually happen, where you can engage in these activities somewhat defensively.
Yeah, and I think it's very easy with. I think this is kind of a brilliant case for government institution that might seek kind of additional power, and because it seems it's very fitting, to be honest, for multiple of reasons. I think first of all, it's like mink farming, which is not a very sympathetic cause for a lot of people, especially like a lot of people in big cities and so on, because it's farming, which is disgusting in terms of climate change and so on. And then it's like also kind of like an excess product. Very excessive.
Well, farming isn't necessarily bad per se. I think it's the way or the type of farming that people have an issue.
Yeah,
with,
right? But I'm not. This is not my opinion, right? This is like the narrative that it plays into. Okay. I think is that for a lot of people who don't really know what like farming is definitely not bad. I mean, that's how we get the majority of our food, right? It's definitely an important element of society. I'm in no way against farming, but I think there's this. I think the case just it really. It's easy to extend your power in this case because it's mink farming, first of all, which is like fur, which most people kind of already think is like there's a lot of people who think like, oh, it's there's like a animal welfare issue, right? And do we really need that? There's a sense of necessity that's not really present, right? Then it's farming, which is also like bad for the environment and so on, and has a really bad rep for that. So I think for a lot of people, they may not have sympathy for the mink farmers. And they say, oh, COVID and human life is way more important and so on. But what they don't fail to see, I guess, is just like, again, what you were talking about before with kind of like the shock doctrine, right? And how it's then used as a kind of a persuasive way to slowly creep into the corridors of power and just like take over more elements of and create, I guess, just create additional elements of unsupervised power in undemocratic with undemocratic means and like extrajudicial tools.
Yeah. I think I'll just say one more thing because I think I could go on for a while about this, but I think there's because the shock doctrine in and of itself is a very meaningful thing, and really getting into depth of how these mechanisms work and this kind of thing, I think is actually really important in a lot of the details. Because these really do shape how like a lot of like significant shocks to the system have changed society and put us on certain trajectories that affect life on this planet for decades to follow. So I just think that's almost a topic in and of itself. But then, and I think there's a lot of first of all a lack of information in terms of how these changes are communicated. Like a lot of things just happen at once, and then the public's like, yeah, we're just dealing with a problem, and then they're not actually they're not left to understand exactly the effects and the implications and the long-term ramifications of some of these changes. But then also I think there's like a simultaneous issue going on in which there's a lot of misinformation or lack of information on exactly how we manage risk and what we consider acceptable versus unacceptable risk. I mean, like with these new they're not new, but with like the recent explosion of prevalence of zoonotic diseases. I mean, we don't talk about how to manage that risk in an effective way. We don't talk about what a consumer can do to deal with that risk and what actually the scope and the scale of the risk looks like. I mean, COVID-19 is just one example, but I think there was like some kind of like avian flu outbreak in June or something. That happened like a week or two ago. I mean, these risks are quite ever present given the way we have structured a lot of our agricultural and other systems, and it's just it's very worth I guess in like it would be. I think people aren't given adequate information to understand what the consequences of a lot of decisions are, just in terms of this type of risk and what exactly the scale and scope of this type of risk is. I mean, without going to like a shit ton of detail on this kind of stuff. But that's, yeah, anyway.
Oh, sure. But I think that's kind of like two different points, right? I mean, I think one element is like we have a general issue when it comes to the way we run, particularly animal like agriculture, right? And the way we as a society are resilient to viruses and diseases like that. And then another element is the way that the whole shock doctrine kind of element, which is how those periods and times of crisis are used to move the scale of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, right? And I think it's just an important principle in general to have that, it is particularly in these times of crises that we need to uphold the rule of law and, have some kind of accountability and transparency when it comes to these issues, right? Because else it just can get very dangerous very quickly. And I think in general, that might be like a continuous trend that we might come back to again and again, is that I think in Denmark, there is this like very real naivety that also exists in many ways in the US, that is it can't happen to us kind of thing when it comes to de-democratization and fascism and all these different kind of like unfortunate political movements that are in many ways are already happening in both countries. And we have very real examples of like war crimes and all this kind of stuff, but we still walk around with this very general idea of like it can't happen to us. We are the good guys, and we are Western, we are free, we are so on, right? We trust each other and blah blah blah. Even though that's just proven time and time again that that's not the truth, right? So I think that's kind of another issue. Anyways, do you have more reflections on this, or should we move on to the
no, I think we should definitely get on to to the election, because it's really hot on the mind, and I think we could explore some of these topics because I think they do have broader implications than simply beyond Denmark. They have quite global implications, but also but definitely what's been happening in terms of transition of power and these kind of things in the US has been, to say in light words, quite comical, right? Like you have Trump's lawyers coming out saying, oh, there's fraud in the election, we're going to take back freedom for the American people. And then at the same time, when they're actually in court, they're like, yeah, this isn't a fraud case. The Trump's own lawyers are saying this is not a fraud case. We're not actually here to argue for fraud, because obviously they don't have any hard evidence of fraud. But what they have is a lot of affidavits, meaning just people saying like, oh yeah, this happened and this is my word. That doesn't actually represent concrete evidence of fraud, especially since a lot of the affidavits are like just saying that like one example of an affidavit was one of the poll workers called me a Karen or something like this. And, last time I checked, that didn't really have to do with election integrity or election fraud. So their current record in the courts, and they have won one case, but their current record, I believe, is 1-30. So 1 win, 30 losses, and many of the cases have been just thrown out of hand, and some even with prejudice, meaning they don't even have the ability to appeal or relitigate some of these cases.
That's such a like the whole Karen thing is just it's like anti right-wing woke.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like,
but
don't identify me as a Karen. Like, what the fuck?
yeah. Whatever it takes to make your weak point. If you don't have evidence, I mean, these kind of arguments are going to be thrown about by either side. I mean, this is how it goes, right? Like, and I think we actually have been going in an even worse direction in terms of just like how the public views democratic systems. Like, for example, in 2016 when Trump won, quote unquote won, everyone said the reason why this happened was because Russia interfered with the election. and he didn't win legitimately. Russia actually, some people even in the early stages were doing exactly what Trump was doing, saying Russia changed the votes, Russia hacked the voting machines. Even people at the top line of quote unquote resistance mainstream media like Rachel Maddow, etc., were making allegations that it like they didn't say, like, because they're a little smarter on the resistance left. Not don't assume this is a compliment. But they'll say like it could, like, some people have been alleging that this has been happening, right? They won't say they themselves are saying that this is happening. They'll be like, some people are alleging.
Spend the whole time talking about it.
Yeah, and then spend the entire hour talking about the underlying evidence of these allegations. But again, these, like, they make sure to distance themselves from actually making that claim, because they could run into legal issues by making a claim that is defamatory and false. So yeah, and then now we have 2020, where we're going to have a huge, I don't remember what the exact percentage is, but a significant percentage, perhaps even a majority of Republicans don't believe that Trump lost the election. And I have some Trump supporters on my Instagram feed, and they routinely share posts. Yeah, of course. You gotta have a wide spectrum of views in your social circles, and some of these people are routinely these are people who wouldn't usually post that much on Instagram, and they have these stories, and how the stories, if you have 2 stories, it's 2 big blocks. It would be little 50 little tiny blocks, and each one would be a video of someone making some different or erroneous claim about potential election fraud or whatever. And yeah, it's just really interesting to see not only the fact that which we will get into in a bit, that America's quote unquote democratic systems are insanely weak just in and of themselves, but also just the fact that public trust is eroding in these systems, but not even in the way that would yield a better outcome for the systems being fixed, just more in a way through a partisan lens of oh, my side says this and your side says that, rather than what's actually the epistemological reality of what's happening in our election processes. And but which is, to me, very unfortunate. And yeah, I think it only serves to erode the institutions, but also it erodes the public's ability to actually be a check on these institutions. So yeah.
Can I take a second, because I think I have 2 points from what you already said, right? And it's beautiful. So first of all, for me, this underlines argument 1, which is the similarity between the Democrats and Republicans, which is that they're doing exactly the same thing now that the Democrats was doing before, and that the Republicans were doing before, right? So it's just kind of this repeat of cycle, which is beautiful. And I think maybe it's just because I have a more current memory of this, but for me, it's just so beautifully illustrated with the whole Russiagate, and then now there's election fraud claims, which is just, they're so similar in so many ways, and the methods being used are also, I mean, they're different, but they're also so similar in so many ways. So it's just it's really beautiful. That's one thing. And then I think the whole Trump's approach to all of this has also been really a brilliant manifestation of what he truly has been through his whole presidency, which is this outrageous claims on Twitter, and then the lawyers coming in afterwards and doing the complete opposite kind of claims in court, right? Or not opposite, right? But very, very different natured claims in court. It's just it's a very, very good manifestation of what the Trump presidency has been, which is also something I hope we get into later, which with the whole discussion around rhetoric and discourse, and then on the other hand, actual policies. And I know we also wanted to talk about I think we also wanted to talk about a comparison between Trump and Bush based on a Greenwald article, right? And stuff like that, which is really, really interesting. So yeah, that was just 2 things I came to mind when you were talking. But we kind of also got a bit off track, right? Because you wanted to talk about the 2000 election, right? Not the current one.
Yeah. We can just do a quick little background to kind of show kind of just how egregious some of the problems in the American electoral system, because when people call the American system, like, I mean, I believe it's The Economist or another, I'll have to double check, but it's a publication, British-based publication, or maybe the Financial Times, I'm not sure, that basically does they do an assessment of democracy, or sorry, systems of governance around the world, and they rate them from like a full democracy and like this like quasi democracy, or like a weak democracy, and then like a hybrid regime, and then like basically a dictatorship. And it, of course, it puts America in the case of weak democracy, and this organization isn't this like, you know, left-wing organization seeking to criticize all the actual problems. You know, it's quite, you know, neoliberal in terms of its ideological disposition, but at the same time,
The Economist, right?
It could have been The Economist ranking. I think, yeah, I think it was The Economist. Yeah, it was called the Democracy Index, I believe. And it was actually compiled by this organization called the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is just a company. I believe it's a subsidiary of a news. Yeah, it's a subsidiary of The Economist, I believe. So yeah, so they have United States below even some Latin American countries, which, you know, the U.S. loves to claim, you know, a lot of these Latin American regimes, except for, of course, the narco states are engaged in undemocratic activity and are deeply problematic.
All the Soviet states, you know?
Yeah, all the quote unquote Soviet states. But, you know, then when you actually see the reality on the ground, I mean, it paints quite a different picture. And I think it's especially transparently highlighted with the results of the 2000 election. Just to get into it, you know, the election was the way it's talked about now is we talk about it like, oh yeah, it's just you know, it was a close election. The Supreme Court eventually came to a decision. You know, there was some disputes and like there's some issues, but ultimately, you know, the system kind of did its job to some extent, and like people don't have like this like to me, I think if people had a full understanding of what happened, I mean, it would be like an outrage kind of thing, not because like, I mean, I would have preferred George Bush lose, maybe we wouldn't be in Iraq, all these kind of things, but at the same time, it's like if it was the other way, I would also prefer like even though I would say like, you know, from an outcome perspective, I would prefer that George Bush would have lost. If the election was given to Al Gore in this way, because I'm of course not a Democratic partisan, I mean, you know, I would have been outraged in the exact same way, because it would just show that our institutions don't work. And pretty much what happens in the United States is you don't actually vote specifically. I mean, you cast a vote of intent to say, I want this person elected, but you actually vote for electors in the United States. Your vote is essentially a suggestion. You're suggesting that an elector will cast his or her vote in a certain direction, right? And
you're voting for someone to vote, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, because they have to, you know, ride their electoral vote on the pony carriage to Washington, D.C.
Jared, what you don't get is that the gatekeepers to make sure that the real public, you know, don't just, you know, same way they have done it now with social media, they go like all nuts and they spread misinformation and they do the wrong choices and so on. So it's just like gatekeepers to make sure that that, you know, they can vote for us to vote and then we vote, kind of thing.
It's super important. It's actually super important to do it that way.
I think so.
And what it serves to do is it serves to maintain like certain aspects of the system while also you know, allowing political parties to be more divorced from their populace and more closely aligned with their actual constituency, which is the financial donor class. And I think that's just really important for a healthy democracy. So
obviously,
yeah. So in Florida, in 2000, when it was Bush versus Gore, a guy named Roger Stone, he's kind of a popular name if people have been following the Russiagate scandal. But back in 2000, he organized what was called the Brooks Brothers riot, where, you know, usually when people think riots in the streets, they think, you know, guys wearing masks and this kind of things. But these were a bunch of consultants and lawyers who went into the Miami-Dade elections board and started making violent threats, pounding glass, just basically harassment of the people that were counting the votes. And the legislature was ultimately so scared that they stopped the vote count. At the time, Miami-Dade was overwhelmingly Democratic in presidential elections. And they also managed to stop the vote count in Jacksonville, a city that would have also gone Democratic. And when they stopped the vote, George W. Bush was ahead by 537 votes. Katherine Harris, who was the Republican Secretary of State of Florida, also the head of the Bush election campaign, certified the results. And this was then challenged to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, you guys can stop counting the vote whenever you want. So like, that's like saying, it's like if I put in, $1,000 into a bucket and you put in $20 into the bucket, but then we discount the first $20 and then we say stop, and then say, oh, this is a legitimate representation of how many dollars were put into the bucket. The Supreme Court said, yeah, we're okay with this happening. So this is actually on US law, a legal precedent for this to happen. And this was done by someone who had, and Jeb Bush was also an elected official in Florida at the time. George Bush, everyone knows Jeb. And
good old Jeb.
And the kicker was that there were at the time, so this is exactly the point, that there were 178,000 votes yet to be counted, almost entirely in a Democratic area. And the Supreme Court still came to the conclusion that they could stop the vote count essentially whenever they want. And that was it. And Bush essentially stole the election in a soft coup in America. And people don't really, people aren't taught that history, unfortunately. And I think that's a big disservice, because, when we talk about, oh, the election in Venezuela is fraudulent, or pick any country, right? Like, it's like this is by definition a fraudulent election. Even if we look past like a lot of the previously systemic issues within the U.S. electoral process, I mean, this was one of the most egregious acts of election fraud, and what I would call a coup in modern election history. So, and then people look at 2016 and they say, this is the last one I'll just touch quickly on. And people noted that Trump won by just a handful of votes in the Rust Belt, right? In like Wisconsin, Michigan, etc. And there's a legendary reporter. Actually, he's the same guy who discovered what happened in Florida and discovered exactly how things were happening in Florida. His name was Greg Palast. He wrote a book about it, and then he did a similar investigation into the 2016 election. And what he discovered in the 2016 election was that in these states, Wisconsin, Michigan, etc., there were actually a sufficient number of votes that were purged illegally that actually would have changed the result of the election. It would have given Hillary Clinton the sufficient votes that she needed to flip those handful of votes and give her the election. And what was really interesting was there was like this critical day, and I'm not sure if he was there at the time, but he definitely reported this. And like Jill Stein was trying to challenge the vote, I believe, in Wisconsin. And because she wanted just a recount and blah, blah, blah. She was saying like a lot of votes were purged, which they were. And but unfortunately, because she, had no chance of winning that state, like not even close, no matter like how you cut it, like with all the purged votes, there was no way she could have ever won the state. They denied her request. But what was interesting at the time that she was making the request was that when she was with her lawyers in the room making these demands, Hillary Clinton's lawyers were also present. And they were kind of just waiting on standby. And eventually, when the race was called for Trump, instead of disputing it in this like way that Trump is doing now, they just walked out of the room and then just certified the election to Trump. So I mean, I get very frustrated when people try to talk about the U.S. as this kind of like functioning democratic system that actually allows, even under its current rules, which are flawed, which allows the rules as they are to work effectively. Because even if you grant the rules, which I don't, to be part of a meaningful and effective democratic process and representative of what I would consider adequate democratic an adequate democratic institution, like yeah, it doesn't pass muster, and I think that's worth yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so. I haven't investigated the 2000 election as much in depth. And I know the overall story, and it's really interesting to hear these like very specific incidences. And I'm also just wondering why Trump didn't, he should have learned something, and just like before the mail-in ballots were counted, he should have just like the day after said like, no, we're stopping, don't worry about it. Anyways, but I think for me the key element is that this is kind of like a really unfortunate analysis that says even under the specific rules that the US democracy entails, fraud is really quite rampant and really problematic, and coups or soft coups happen. But for me, more than anything, if you just investigate from kind of a bird's eye view, the overall structure of the US elections, there's just so many fundamental flaws that really, I think there's kind of even an issue with calling it a democracy. And I know that's not what we want to go too much into today, but I think it's something we can touch upon briefly. And I think it's kind of, it's an interesting way of manufacturing consent and of changing I'm struggling with words right now, but it's an interesting way of moving the scale of what is counted as a democracy and what's not counted as a democracy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even though when we say it in our context, like we move the scale here, but when it's another context, the scale is right back over here. So it's like it's one scale for me, another scale for thee.
Yeah, but it's also, if we really want to use the word democracy in a meaningful way, then we cannot say it about the US. That's my position, at least.
I agree. I completely agree, though. I completely agree.
So I just kind of want to come on the record and saying that I do not believe the US is a democracy. Period.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even go as far as say weak democracy. I mean, maybe there's an argument to do that, but I think it's problematic. I would really like if we could invent another word for it, because I think it lends legitimacy to the completely corrupt system where, ultimately, if you actually want to get anything done, you have to have an immense amount of power, usually in the form of money, right? Which is just the present case right now in the US. So I really think there's an issue, and I would take issue with this kind of like academic assessment of the US as even a kind of weak democracy, because I think it really it's a way, it's a legitimization even, which is absurd to say, right? That calling the US a weak democracy is a legitimization of what it actually is, right? And I think that's super problematic for us personally.
Yeah, agreed. I think the democracy index that I cited earlier actually it doesn't at all meet the criteria that I would use to even describe a semi-functioning democracy. So I think it's definitely worth litigating. We can, I guess, get into the weeds on this specific issue maybe another time. Mm-hmm. But if you want to maybe fast forward to kind of what happened here in 2020, where we had, because we're talking about all these problems, but thankfully, finally, democracy has won, and truth is on the ballot, integrity is on the ballot, our way of life is on the ballot, all these things, and it all won. And I'm just so relieved finally that we got the Agent Orange Cheeto machine out of the office, because now we can finally get back to this amazing system of democracy that we were so accustomed to, having our votes rejected in, and that's super important.
Yeah, and I think for me it's just like hashtag resistance and hashtag never Trump, which is just, as you say, like super important for the weak democracy of the US to continue to really spread freedom around the world and within its own borders as well. So it's definitely going to be it's really it's an interesting time, and I think there's a lot of things we can go over in terms of this election, and I'm also really looking forward to the next week to come also, when I think we're going to get some official statements on like cabinets from Biden.
Yeah, and what we have so far is horrible. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so what we have so far is great, and we should also talk about that, and the way that they're legitimizing those choices, I think, is also really interesting, and really goes into the it's just such a beautiful manifestation of what the US two main parties fundamentally are. I think personally, and we can talk about a bit about that later. But yeah, I don't know. How should we start this? How should we start by unpacking this? Like, I have a few different graphs. Maybe I can share them here. Let me see. Do you want to start by going into like what the results show?
Like kind of what the standings are for the election, like in terms of like, I mean, like whether Biden won this state, that state, or another state, or is this what you mean, or?
I mean, I don't think we need to be so descriptive about it. I think it's more about like I have at least a few different interesting graphs and statistics on, on what different groups voted for each candidate, like demographically, both in terms of education, ethnicity,
and that's
men,
what
women,
I'm
and so on.
So yeah. So I guess while you pull that up, one data point to note, and I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I believe every minority group, so when it comes to Latinos, Blacks, I think non-college educated as a whole, all moved in the direction of Trump. So Trump made historic gains in these like key minority blocks. And then the main group that actually, or I believe maybe even the only group that actually went more to Biden was suburban whites. So actually white men. I think it was 5 points, made a 5-point swing towards Biden, and that really gave him the edge he needed in the election. And a lot of this can be attributed to coronavirus, et cetera. But at the same time, I mean, I think it's worth examining the fact that the media spent 4 years explicitly calling Trump a racist, and I don't even have a problem with that characterization. It's just they characterize him as a bigot who has all these issues, but he's driving historic minority voter turnout. And I think it's worth understanding, like what do people actually care about? I mean, do they care about these kind of social issues to the extent where it outweighs their basic economic interests? I mean, I think it's hard for people to understand that, a Black family that is struggling to put food on the table has food insecurity, or has an ability to pay for, their medical expenses. They're going to vote on their perceived economic interests before they're going to vote on any sort of
hypothetical racist
cultural agenda. But even if it's true, I mean, like I think a lot of people who are voting for Trump might have even thought some of these things, but had this perception that Trump was a bigger, or would represent a stronger economic relief for them, even though there's no evidence for this, than a Joe Biden presidency. And I think it's worth but because that issue was never litigated properly, the public never really had like this clear view that not only is Trump an issue in terms of a lot of these issues that people, I would say, rightfully care about, like talking about discrimination, et cetera, and how he actually legislates in this space. But at the same time, like if people aren't led to understand that, like who he's subservient to in terms of corporate and financial interests, it really leaves out a key part of the picture. But I think a big reason why this was never really on the table to begin with is because a lot of these people that are in the so-called donor class, they're also highly supportive of Pelosi, Schumer, Biden. And it's hard to like throw such a heavy stone when you're in a house made of the most thin glass you could ever imagine, right? So anytime, like, and it's also the media, the corporate media, I don't think has much of an interest in kind of alerting people to the issues with the financialization of our political system. I mean, because I mean that same financialization that causes problems, let's put it lightly, with our political system, causes similar problems in our media ecosystem and media landscape.
Sure. I agree. I mean, I think just to set the context of what you're talking about for those who haven't followed it as clearly, and also just a small technical thing. I just got a new laptop, so I have to apparently like accept that Zoom can share my screen, and then I have to restart Zoom. So I think maybe I send you like two of them, the
I see them,
nicest one. So maybe you can try to share them.
Yeah, let me try that.
So what we're gonna see now in a second, if you can share them, I'm not sure if it will work, but is that basically what we saw in the election, as might be surprised for a lot of people if they don't follow the election carefully, is that Trump got more black votes, more Hispanic votes, in general, more votes from people of color than any Republican since the 1960s or something like that, right? And
so can you see these two things on my screen? Or?
One of them looked a little bit funny, but yeah, you can see it, I guess. It works, I think. So this one is just like going through like how has the different I think what they did is they looked at areas where there was like a considerable shift from Democratic to Republican or the other way around, and basically highlighted the most important shifts. So you can see that there's a lot of white non-college men who moved to Biden, which is quite interesting. The first one, the black one in the top, and then you see this another trend with non-college white women. And yeah, not to go through all of them, but let's talk about the most interesting one. I mean, if you look at it, then again, people of color voted increasingly for Trump. Still a majority Democrat, important to emphasize, but increasingly for Trump, and I think more than any election since 1960 again, which is quite interesting considering this portrait as a neo-Nazi and fascist and like I mean constantly the same way they did with Sanders, like popular media comparing him to Hitler or other fascists, which is again an interesting strategy that they keep multiplying, and then still again like more people of color voting for Trump than ever before, and as you say, like it's surely because of the economic interests, right? But I think it's both because of the economic interests, and I'm not sure you covered this, but I think it's also because of the immense disbelief and distrust of these Clinton, Obama era Democrats that has just taken more Wall Street money than any presidents before them, I think, once time again. And you could go into a deeper historical analysis of how ever since like Citizens United and the Clinton era movement and the whole new liberal movement within the Democratic Party, going away from unions, going away from workers' rights, and moving more towards satisfying the Wall Street constituents and the 1% or whatever you want to call them, and increasingly shifting the election funds from Republican to Democratic side. You just see each year that the Democratic Party becomes more and more a party for people with a certain economic status, and a party for people in the top of society, and the Republican Party moving more and more towards being a kind of workers coalition with with some anti-socialist Hispanic communities, and like still a large portion of non-college white voters. It's really I think there's multiple things that are really interesting about this, especially because I think from a Danish perspective, we really have this idea that the left always works for workers and for unions, and that the Republicans, I think this narrative is really, really strong still in Denmark, that the Republicans are kind of high donor based, like high donation voter based party, right? That really relies on these like big oil industries and so on, right? But if you actually look at the reality, and we should have pulled some numbers up about that as well, is that's really not the case, right? I mean, you have these donors in both parties, but really the Democratic Party has been more than anything been able to get the full support of a lot of these industries, whether it's Silicon Valley or the oil industry or Wall Street, is they're much more affluent in these environments, and there's so much to unpack in this, I think, and a lot of interesting conversations about what is going to be the future identities of those two parties. And I know both Matt Taibbi and Greenwald and I also Thomas Frank and a lot of different people have tried to go into these discussions, and there's, we can have a lot of speculations, but we don't know what the future is going to bring, right? But it's really interesting to see that Trump of all presidents, which again has been portrayed as like the most racist president in the history of the United States. I think it's fair to say that the media has, both the Danish media and like the left-leaning, center-leaning media in the US has portrayed him as, even though that's also super questionable, has gotten this immense amount of votes from people of color in a country that's also so racially divided currently.
I just think our current landscape just is not equipped to at all deal with this kind of conversation. And I think that's really the problem, is that, I mean, the only way for anyone to even get these conversations, they have to turn to someone like Greenwald, who is on Substack, same with Taibbi, also on Substack. And Thomas Frank, he writes books. I think he said he's done writing books. I don't know, but I mean, the people that are actually litigating this argument from like kind of what actually is representing what people are thinking, and also how to like maybe inform people of what actually is necessary to understand what they ultimately want to demand from systems of governance. Like these type of systems and these types of conversations just don't exist in the mainstream spaces. I mean, like the conversations are very reductive, like, oh, he's a bad guy, look what he wrote on Twitter, this kind of thing. And this kind of analysis just isn't adequate to capture what exactly is affecting the material interests of people's lives. And so it's very easy to understand why people are just making a different decision. Like they're not doing it because like they're enriched with a great degree of information from Rachel Maddow or Chris Hayes. They're doing it because they're like, life for me isn't working the way it is, and maybe this guy who's shouting from the rooftop saying I'll do something a little different, like even like if they don't actually understand what this difference is, like of course it's just more corporate consolidation, more wealth transfer from the working class to the corporate class, but since that's not articulated by the media, people don't actually understand. Like, so people say, oh, why are you voting against your self-interest? It's like people don't understand, people aren't given the adequate information to understand what exactly these politicians are doing and how they actually affect their self-interest. So it's like if someone says, I want to give you healthcare, I want to give you a job. I mean, their self-interest is having healthcare and a job. So it's like if someone's saying that, people are going to vote along those lines. I mean, the fact that the politicians that they're voting for are doing the exact opposite, that's an issue. And if people were able to put those together, which is what you would require a media to do, to actually line up the evidence, because people are busy, people have 3 jobs, people have a lot of things to do in their lives, and you need a media apparatus to actually like connect the dots in a way that a lot of people don't have time to do. And unfortunately, that kind of institution just doesn't exist in the media landscape, right, in the mainstream media landscape right now.
Plus, I think, and maybe you can speak a little bit about your personal experience with this, like, because I'm curious, because I think when we from the EU and Denmark, we watched US elections, the media narrative that we are told is completely different, I imagine, than some of the narratives that actually penetrate the general public, let's say that. For one, because of the immense amount of like negative commercials that are run on like TV and in commercial breaks and so on, and how like for Danes this is probably a pretty like absurd thought, but in the US, like political commercials on TV is very, very common and quite something that's like allowed, which is not allowed in Denmark, where we're only allowed to put up those posters everywhere, on like outside in the streets.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, like, from your experience, and of course you also have a very particular experience, right? And you have informed yourself through very alternative news medias and so on. And so maybe your experience is also not representative of an average American, but how is it different following the election from a country like Denmark than following it when you're in the US? Can you recognize some of the things that I mentioned, or am I off?
So from my understanding is, I mean, so I do understand the influence of money in the political system is just so much more regulated and so much more I think even understood by the public in Denmark than it is in the United States. Like in the United States, we just get bombarded with ads and campaigns and door knockers and all this kind of stuff, and we just think like this is all part of like a legitimate democratic process. And but the reality is like who gets to put ads on TV are people who have typically exorbitant amounts of money. I mean, of course, like there's a new wave of progressives coming in the Democratic Party that are, you know, crowdfunding and getting money to do these same kind of campaigns, but from a grassroots perspective. But the entire system of campaign finance, it only serves to dilute messages, right? Like what you would want is an information apparatus that tries not to color in the lines of like positions and kind of present them in a way that, like, you know, the public actually has like, or the public can be duly informed on how to actually make decisions that most align with their interest and align.
Which is super difficult though, because again, then you're already talking about gatekeeping, right?
Yeah, of course.
Which is where the discussion around free speech and how you deal with media information is really, really difficult and nuanced, I think.
Yeah.
But I guess the reason why I try to bring it up is that I think an element of that probably also plays into like the amount of misinformation in the system probably also plays into why there is such a disparity between what would make logical sense for a lot of Europeans, a lot of like a lot of Danish people watching the US elections, and then you see results that are quite contradictory to some of these ideas, right? So I don't know. I'm thinking that misinformation plus, you know, the growing tired of you know, the establishment, and then, as you said, like Trump sitting and yelling in a corner and seeming like radical in a way, and seeming different than the current status quo is, and then again his like strong emphasis on like self-interest in the name of the American worker and an American people, like this kind of fake populism kind of approach. Really does well to explain like the majority of some of the outcomes we have seen in terms of
and it's also just important to understand like what happened to the word populism over time. I mean, the term populism is a completely hijacked word. I mean, it really started as like a grassroots labor term, like a very strictly left-wing, talking quite emboldeningly about, you know, the importance of labor organizing and working among the working class to, you know, protect their own interests and resist corporate control. But now populism is talked about like this, like it's like a form of xenophobia and racism, and it's like that's not at all.
That's the only way it's talked about in Denmark.
Yeah, it's the only way it's talked about all throughout Europe. I mean, if you talk about Marine Le Pen in France, oh, she's a populist. If you talk about
Viktor Orban,
Rasmus Paludan, he's a, I don't know if you could call him a populist, but if you call like a DF, like a populist party,
like Pia Kjærsgaard.
Yeah, Peter Kjærsgaard, or Sweden Democrats, or
Viktor Orban in Hungary, or whatever.
Yeah, Viktor Orban. Yeah, all of these figures are described as populists, but they actually are quite the opposite. I mean, they of course talk the language of the working class, but their idea of quote unquote populism is just restricting immigration and then corporate consolidation and handing money out to their elite buddies, right? Like this has nothing to do with actually what actually populism means and what it actually represents. And I think because of the consolidation of power and information, it's very hard for like actual populist forces to actually grow in our current systems of power. And I think the first step in towards actually realizing a more populist future is understanding a lot of the barriers and institutional barriers that prevent a lot of these forces from growing, unfortunately.
For sure, and I also want to just maybe we can add a link below. Like I think the useful ideas talk with Thomas Frank on this whole topic is super and Thomas Frank in general is super interesting to like he did a really nice investigation of the whole
Exactly.
epidemiology of
Yes.
etymology
Etymology.
of the word populism and the
Yes.
sort of political development around it. It's super interesting to get into. And I think you definitely hit the nail on the head to say like, yeah, there's a lot of really interesting elements around that discussion. I lost my train of thought now. Let me see.
But I think if you want to talk about something a little different, I think one thing I definitely worth talking about is like this because this is what's going to happen every single time, as it always has, is the concept of lesser of two evils voting and what it means from a long-term perspective and how we should actually view these systems, right? So it's like let's say we could a hypothetical, which I think is also close to the reality, but let's just put it as a hypothetical for now. You say, okay, if you vote for Hillary versus Trump, you get like let's just pretend on all metrics we care about. Let's pretend you can quantify it with a number. Let's pretend you get a 5% better set of outcomes. Like you don't get any prison reform, you don't get any reform on war, you don't get any reform on healthcare. Like all these things remain unchanged. But then you get, you don't get the Trump tax plan, so you don't get this like, super quick upwards transfer of wealth like they did in the Trump tax plan. Like just a few
deconstruction of the EPA and stuff like that.
Yeah, deconstruction of certain institutions in a more expeditious way than would have otherwise happened under Clinton administration, and then you say, okay, let's just pretend 5%, like just making that number up. That's not even exactly what I think, but let's just say it's a 5%. Net positive on all the metrics that a person would maybe care about, and what that, but then that 5% between the people in the immediate term, what it represents is it means the next term, the person after that person can become, let's say, 50% worse, and then the person who's like on the Democratic side is 5% better than that 50% worse. And then that keeps happening every single time. I mean, to me, that's an untenable voting strategy. It's one that, because when people tell you to vote for lesser two evils, to say, okay, look at the 5%, right? And I see the 5%. But then if you say, okay, if it gets 50% worse every single 4 years, I mean, to me, it's like you're inappropriately discounting the future suffering of the victims of the long-term harms that perpetuating the system would cause. And I think it's worth examining, and this is, as Chris Hedges puts it, like stepping out into the wilderness and kind of, looking for a different path to affecting political change, whether it be a general strike, forming a third party, which takes a long time, but just rejecting the current system at all costs, because I mean, like as it is, it's the path, it's the slightly slower path to damnation, right? It's a slower path to extinction, right? And it's like this, and I don't use damnation in like a religious sense, but I'm just saying like it's the path to really catastrophic outcomes, like and I think it's very worth like because even right now, right, Trump is talking about running again in 2024 while he's simultaneously contesting the election. And if Trump runs in 2024 and like they did a poll of Republican voters, like the majority of Republican voters want Trump to win. So if he came into the primary, he would win 100%, or not 100%, but like he would very likely win. And yeah, very likely win. And it's just to say that like if that is the case, right, even whether he does or not, just him threatening to do it, what you're going to have under the Biden administration is, oh, don't criticize Biden, don't say anything too bad about Biden, because why? Because you're going to help Trump in 2024, right? And it's this kind of like just like calcification.
Never-ending narrative.
Yeah, but the narrative, like, so for example, the political systems are already calcified as they are for working people. They work quite smoothly. Like the oil is quite well greased on the chain to help the owner class and the donor class. But the it's been as rusted as ever can be when it comes to helping the average person. And
I think it's like a continuous incremental development of seeing how far can you push it without people being too unsatisfied.
Exactly. And I've always wondered when that point was, but I don't think it's, worth asking okay, when is this going to happen? I think we need to actually like take a stand against the system and just be we reject the system as it is now, and say that we actually, through nonviolent civil disobedience and other methods, just say we need to demand something different, because not only is it against the interests of working people, it's even against the interest in some respects of the owner class. Like, if the working
Completely.
class doesn't have sufficient capital to buy the products that the owner class produces, then the system doesn't work, right? And what you have is like an increasing indentured base of the population, where their velocity of money is over 100%, meaning that the amount of money they spend exceeds what they take in, and you have record high levels.
Just give them credit cards. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, just give them credit cards. But we do have record levels of household debt, and that's one of the key metrics for signs of economic weakness. So it's like whenever you turn on the news, they'll say, "Oh yeah," and I hear this in Denmark too, like, "Yeah, but Trump gave us a really good economy, and that's going to be a tough one to argue against." I'm like, what do you mean he gave us a good economy? It's like if you talk about how stock owners are doing, the owner class is doing, in a sense, even for them, I mean, in a sense, it's a good economy built on a house of cards. I wouldn't call it a good economy itself, but then even if you assume, like, let's say that's even those things are quote unquote more solid than they are, which I wouldn't agree with. Like what you have is you have a lot of other economic metrics like labor participation rate, household debt,
suicide rates,
rates of drug overdose, this kind of thing, levels of underemployment. These things are all at either record highs or at dangerously high levels that are some of these are
continuous highs.
Yes, and some of these are key indicators of economic problems in the near horizon. And an
example of what's really problematic around that is like using the employment rate as a useful indicator of how the economy is doing.
I think they use the E03,
without looking at anything around the quality of employment, right? Which is just super problematic, and people having 3 jobs to sustain minimum standard of living, right? It's there's a lot to unpack in this, right?
Yes.
Going back to the lesser of two evils, this is something that I've had countless discussions around with friends and families and colleagues over the last, even during the primaries and so on. And I have continuously, and still do, with some uncertainty, because I think it's really difficult to actually say something certain about this, because we don't know what Biden's going to do. We don't know what Trump was going to do in their second term. We do have some indications and so on, but we don't know for sure. So I think there's an element of uncertainty, and I think you can have various outcomes in both situations, whether it's Biden or Trump winning the second term. But if we just want to dwell on for a second on what is actually the lesser of two evils, I think that's an interesting discussion, right? Because that how you answer that question, and I totally agree with you around the whole argument around that, continuing in this kind of lesser of two evils is super dangerous. And I totally agree with you that they're already now using Trump saying that he's going to run in 2024 as an argument for the left not to criticize the Biden administration. They have also developing other arguments, and they're also using kind of vogue politics to we're hopefully going to talk about some of the nominations to the cabinet already a little bit later, and get into that, how they're using like identity politics to get oil industry executives or people who's been involved in the oil industry into the administration. But going back to this idea of is Biden actually lesser of two evils, I think is also an interesting question, because for me, it really depends on what kind of time perspective you take in that analysis, right? Exactly. Because, and in some ways, I also hate the kind of Slavoj Žižek. He also, when Trump won the first time, he thought it would be a good thing because it's gonna.
Yeah, I don't like this kind of just like oh yeah, it's good. Like that's not at all how I think about it. It's like. Because it's just too removed. Like you can't say that like a bad outcome is good just because it could lead to a better future outcome. It's like you can, of course, but I'm saying like in my opinion, like I would want to say like like we just have to look very seriously about like what actually are the implications of each outcome, and like if these implications are unacceptable from on both sides of the coin, then we need either a new coin or a new game, right? Like it's like
Yeah, but I think there's also, I don't know, I think there's a very real argument still to be had around the fact that, you know, right now the democratic establishment and the elite around that, which is super problematic and responsible for potentially some of the worst policies that the US have enacted both domestically and internationally over the last 50 years, right? At least they are in strong competition, the two parties, right? So it's really problematic people who are in charge now, and they have gotten the perfect, from my perspective, the perfect election. So
yeah,
they have
agreed.
gotten the presidency, and they have sort of rectified the U.S. democracy by removing the fascist Trump, and then they have lost power in both the House and the Senate, right? So this basically gives them free hands to and even more than that, a lot of progressive candidates in a lot of House races and Senate races around the world, around the country have also been lost, right? So you even have a kind of a growing sentiment that the progressive agenda and the defund the police and so on, which I also think is problematic from like a strategic point of view, as a campaign. You really have a very real strong sense that and critique of those campaigns that they were actually responsible for it getting this close, even though it's like an almost electoral college victory, right? You can definitely argue that that a lot of the key states were closer than Biden would have liked, and in those cases, blame the progressives, right? Blame the left. So you have this kind of power consolidation of the center right part of the Democratic Party, and for them it's the best election possible, right? Because of the situation in the House of the Senate, they are going to be able to continuously remain incompetent and incapable of getting through any of the progressive policies that they have actually promised and campaigned on and gotten votes on, and then they can continue just to serve again their main constituent, which is the Wall Street and Silicon Valley, right? And different energy monopolies, which I think definitely begs the question of whether it is in terms of life saved and life lost, and quality of life lost / gained over the next 10 years, is that going to be worth it, right? I think there's a real argument like that.
Yeah, and I think even like a key thing to say would be, no matter what side you fall on this issue, whether or not it's meaningful to vote Trump or Biden, to protect the interests of people, like provide healthcare and wars, all these kind of things, like it's just so clear that both of these parties are so calcified in their ability to actually govern and legislate that, I mean, we do need to actually have meaningful alternatives politically to deal with these realities. Because if we just confine ourselves to say, okay, electoral politics is the only mechanism by which we can enact change and create better futures for our communities, we're left with this conversation. Oh, do we vote for Biden or do we vote for Trump? And is it okay? Is it not okay? And no matter what the outcome of these things are, I mean, a lot of people have a lot of problems, and it's just, it doesn't meet the moment either way. So it's like, whether or not you vote or don't vote, I mean, there needs to be, like, you can vote, like if, for example, someone who votes for Biden but then says, okay, we also need to build a third party, and works tirelessly to build a third party, I would say that person is doing more than anyone who just says, yeah, well, F the system and I'm just going to go like not do anything, right? Like it's not to say that that's like an irrational decision given the choices you're presented, but it's just to say that, like, it's important to understand like what actually are the direction, like what actually are the actionable steps we need to take to actually enact change, rather than just being like, okay, is this okay, or is this a little better, or is this a little worse? Like, it's like, no, how do we actually create the systemic actionable change that we actually want to see reflected on our systems of governance and other institutions?
No, for sure. Totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally agree. But on the other hand, you could also be, it's kind of the same thing again, right? Because I think there's still an argument whether you vote or not, right? And whether you actually, consolidate, because whether you like it or not, this consolidation of power that has occurred now within the democratic establishment is still going to be present, right? And it's still going to be having an impact on how the future unfolds. So I think there is definitely a very, very problematic aspect around that. You know, it is a really difficult, I think, dilemma whether personally, if I had the choice, whether I should vote or not, and whether to, yeah. I think that's a really difficult discussion.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think we can maybe continue to litigate it, like maybe in a more long form, but also I think if we want to kind of keep it succinct and kind of like come into it like somewhat of a close, we can talk a little bit about kind of like how this actually all fits into a Danish context. What is the kind of Danish relationship to the American state, to not in specifics, but just from a more high level perspective, and kind of what we expect to see coming from the Biden administration. I think those are two key points I think we could kind of wrap up with.
I would suggest that looking into the Biden presidency is probably something that maybe would deserve a longer format, and maybe something we could do maybe we could do like a podcast when we have like a cabinet, and maybe when he's actually elected, go into like a deeper discussion around that.
Kind of his history and then what we expect going forward. Okay, exactly. That's a good idea. But we can talk a little bit about kind of Denmark's relationship with both administrations, and I think it's important to understand like kind of what role Denmark exists in. I mean, not even to speak of Europe more broadly, but just Denmark specifically, how they have a relationship with the US, like what the implications are of changing administrations, and how it affects the relationship over time, right? And it seems to me that almost like no matter what the US does, Denmark is relatively committed to maintaining a relationship with the US, because I think cosmetically, having Trump in office is a lot worse because he's, uncouth, he's, not a well-spoken individual. But from an actual like behind the scenes, like what's actually happening with these relationships in terms of trade, in terms of shared foreign policy goals. I mean, Trump was a little bit annoying to Europe as a whole and Denmark, because he was saying like he wanted, and Denmark is included in this list, he wanted the European nations to raise their percent GDP into, I believe, NATO contribution, just defense as a whole, to raise it to 2%. I think Denmark is maybe 1.3. I can't remember what it was, but it's quite a bit below. And
also the very important case of buying Greenland, that's
super important. Then you can spend your money on F-35 fighter jets, which is super important. I think Denmark did purchase some. I don't know if they're F-35s, but some kind of jets that were.
Yes, I think it was F-35.
F-35s, yeah, of course. Expensive jets that when the program first started, they couldn't even get them off the ground. So I mean, what better use for dollars that you pay into the system? Because I mean, in Denmark they have a fundamentally different view of taxation, right? Like, of course, some people view taxation as theft. It depends on who you are. It's not to say Denmark exists monolithically, but
generally speaking.
But generally speaking, when you talk to like a Danish person about taxes, they'll talk about the benefits that are associated with the tax system. It's like you don't pay taxes because you just want to throw money in a toilet. You pay taxes because you actually perceive a benefit from the system of taxation, right? That's why it's called skat, not called. Like the English word tax has a very negative connotation. The Danish word skat has a very positive connotation. So it's like. As far as I know, I mean, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong.
I think it depends a bit on if you're on the left or the right side of the political system, right? Sure. But generally speaking, I would say that it's more positive than negative compared to countries like the US, for example, right?
Sure.
And there's definitely a higher degree of trust in the state and state institutions and so on.
Yeah. Okay. So in that context, it's just to say that, like, for the average Dane, like if they say, if someone tells them that they're going to 10x their spending on F-35 fighter jets, and then the Danish person, that like the government says that, the Danish person says, what do we get from the F-35 fighter jets? And then the Danish government says safety and security. It's like, and then you say safety and security from what? And then the government says threats, foreign, not domestic, but foreign threats, and they say what foreign threats, and then they'll just,
Inshallah.
just make up a laundry list of threats. But the Danish public isn't convinced by these arguments. They're not convinced by the case that they need to have U.S. levels of defense spending, where I think at this point it's almost 60 or over 60% of total discretionary federal spending goes into our Defense Department. I mean these kind of ideas from a Danish perspective sound absurd. Like because the people on the right who view taxation as something that should be ultimately reduced to some extent, they would say, okay, either way, I would want. I'm talking about from an electorate perspective. I don't know what the politicians are really saying. Maybe they're more on board with this, but from an electorate perspective, they're not saying like, oh yeah, we want to just explode our defense budget and have this like military industrial complex in Denmark. So it's either less taxes, more money in my pocket, or keep the tax rate relatively similar, and then also provide social services. Like this idea that we just want to have like a military for the sake of weaponry is not a concept that is very fond of in the Danish perspective, as far as I'm aware. So I'll also feel free to correct me on any assumptions I make about the Danish public, because I definitely feel myself kind of reaching into the woods and maybe making a little bit of errors here. But it's just to say that given these attitudes, it's very hard to conceive of a Danish government that would actually have any kind of issue with the American system, because ultimately the Danish government, no matter who's the face of the American government, is in line with a lot of the political realities that America exports throughout the world, even if they don't adopt all of these things for themselves.
I think it's kind of it's the same thing. It goes into the same area around discourse and rhetoric versus policy.
Yeah, exactly.
That has kind of been like a continuous paradox in the U.S. presidency of Donald Trump, with Democrats on the one hand saying how horrible he is and how irresponsible and fascist and like he stole the election and he's a puppet for Russia and whatnot, while at the same time co-signing and sponsoring, and I don't know if they co-signed it, but at least they definitely voted for it, a lot of the bills that gave him like exceeding spy authority, tools and spying tools, and also like higher military budgets and so on and so on and so on, right? You probably wouldn't do that with somebody who you think is trying to take over your country and exactly. Your government's democratic established institutions. So there is this very, very wide gaps whenever we talk about something with Trump. I think we always have to be very careful in analyzing the distinction between his rhetoric and his actual policies. I think that's just like a good rule of thumb when it comes to Trump, and I think it's also a good rule of thumb when it comes to people's relationship to Trump, whether it's Democrats in the US or it's Danish governments or other foreign governments, because again, I think most Danish politicians has been kind of like disturbed with Trump, both on the right and the left. You have some conservatives, especially in like youth parties, that have been more positive to him from my knowledge. And you do have like a pro-Trump group of people in Denmark, but I think they are a considerable minority, especially when you come to like parliamentary politicians, where most of them, they have not really felt sympathetic towards him, and try to, in one way or another, when speaking publicly, distance themselves from him, while at the same time kind of being, but we still have to be friends with the United States,
of course,
right? And we still have to do everything. We still have to be the little lapdog, which has been, I think, a very comical and interesting line dance kind of to watch the Danish politicians do, because you know, they really have to kind of engage in the same kind of manipulation that Trump does, where there's this like very severe distinction between rhetoric and discourse and policy again, right?
Yes,
which
exactly.
is a continuous trend within politics that, you know, you always have to watch out for. So as you say, like, you know, Denmark continues to support and you know, follow the general direction of the US. I mean, of course, there's some elements like the Paris Agreement and the leaving of the WHO and so on, where Trump was stepping over his mandate,
for sure,
as a world leader, and where the European powers. But I would also be interested to try to investigate that more precisely, because I do see some elements where the European leaders actually did follow that, even though they all went out in the beginning and said like, oh no, this is wrong, and so on, and then actually followed a line, right? Line. So that could be interesting to also investigate it further and more in depth. But it's definitely something that's been really difficult for them to manage and navigate, I think. And it's of course been easier in more absurd situations, again with like the Greenland thing, where vEHRX could come out and play strong woman to say, oh no, we're definitely not going to do that, and blah blah blah. And there was also a bit of a debacle around, you know, the primaries with Bernie Sanders, where, you know, he brought Denmark up as an example of the way of like envisioning like a future US, right? And saying, okay, look at Denmark, look at Sweden, look at Finland, these countries where, you know, there's a lot of these like viral Danish videos around how politicians or journalists, they go out and contradict some of the Fox News or MBC narratives around Denmark, and try to, you know, support Bernie Sanders kind of arguments. But in general, when we look at the politicians, you see this kind of disgusting tendency that, you know, whether it's continuing our support for your war crimes and blah 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 blah, or illegal wars or whatever, or continuous illegal kind of occupation of Iraq, which is also just absurd and impossible, like incredible that nobody talks about that more. Or, you know, whether it's Assange and not talking about that at all.
I have to send you an interview actually after we go offline. You'll appreciate it. Yeah,
nice. Like all these different areas is just Denmark are continuously following in line, and supporting all the worst aspects of Trump's you know, foreign policy.
Yes.
But yeah, I guess that's because they are also the foreign policies of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party without Trump, right? Which is kind of the main point we're trying to make.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, I don't know if I have any other thoughts on Danish politics but maybe we can talk about Biden.
I think we should reserve our conversation about like Biden as a whole for another time, because we'll have to go into his record and talk about.
I was thinking Biden and maybe reactions from like Danish politicians.
Okay,
to Biden's.
You could tell me a little bit about this. This I'm not so familiar with. I would actually be curious to hear.
I mean, we also talked about this last time. I mean, we should do like a segment at some point, like going into the actual like news feeds of the
I think that'll be meaningful.
And that could be quite fun, I think. But I do remember that, you know, there's a lot of Danish politicians who reacted in awe and really distressed around Trump refusing to receive the election, right? Despite the Democrats spending 2 years, 3 years, whatever, doing exactly the same thing.
Exactly the same thing, yeah.
But again, I think there's an interesting, and maybe we can just end on this weird little side note, tangent.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You mentioned the whole story about Hillary's lawyers being in the room with Jill Stein's lawyers and so on, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting when you said that. I was really wondering what is the interest of them not going against the results, right? What is the interest of them not, you know, and and that's kind of the yeah. I really
It's
wonder.
it's difficult because I mean we can go into a lot of speculative case. I mean what we have from a factual perspective is we just know they were in the room. They had the opportunity to make a legal dispute and they chose not to, right? And then we also know that the votes were there for them to actually have a result in their favor for the election. I mean, like these are things that we know, but then anytime we want to ascribe motives and these kind of things, of course, like we have some evidence to suggest that some things are more likely, but we can't say it with like the degree of certainty that like, okay, the lawyers were in the room, this could have happened, blah, 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 like that we know, but but then at this point, it's like, it will have to get into some degree of speculation, like why did they do that? And they haven't come out and said like, no, they haven't come out and said anything. They come out and said Russia lost us the election, right? And they're peddling this narrative, and I think it's suggestive that there's just so much continuity in what happens between administrations that it doesn't really matter if Hillary Clinton is sitting in the White House or sitting outside, just existing and doing her own thing, influencing people behind the scenes.
Paris.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it does highlight this kind of reality where it's just not so critical to the establishment of both parties, like the donor base, who is really managing the corporate state and what faces on it. Because I mean, they're willing to put up with Trump doing it because he did, and then now that he's gone, because he was unsavory for a lot of the same policies that they would have advocated for regardless. They like a more a better smile on the face of the janitor to manage, because that's really how I view the U.S. president. It's more like a janitor in a company, right? Like, of course they have a lot of unilateral power to do a lot of different things, but because there's so many interests in pulling the strings that they're subservient to, they don't so much call so many of the high level shots on a lot of different things. Like, I mean, a lot of this highlighted, Trump said, oh yeah, we're pulling the troops out. And then the guys will come out, oh no, we're actually not going to do that, right? It's like the president actually does have the power to unilaterally pull the troops out. And, how the hell did it happen that, the troops are still there, right? And it just shows that, and part of it is because Trump is incompetent, but it just shows that, if you have this like manager of the corporate donor state, I mean, there just won't be any real substantive resistance to these policy lines that they wish to peddle.
I don't think it's, I mean, maybe some of it is incompetence, but I would rather probably say it's self-interest.
Yeah, I think so.
I think that would be my answer, because I think that's the same thing we saw with Obama, right? That it's in their self-interest and their, political power ultimately, right? That they ascertain and, engage with these interests and maintain the whether it's the Pentagon or it's the CIA or whatever is interest that, that they continuously back and support those institutions, because they are inevitably also instrumental element for them to maintain their power and their access to wealth and their access to
Yeah, I mean, what did Obama do as soon as he left office? He was giving speeches on the boats with Richard Branson, hanging out with all these billionaires. I mean, it couldn't be any more clear what their self-interests are and how they want to spend their time as soon as they leave these political positions.
Yeah, and I mean, more than anything, the ultimate, true display of the Democratic Party came after 2008, where, he had the Senate, he has the House, he had everything. He had like the full, complete backing of the Democratic, of the whole
but
people.
Dude, his hands were tied, dude. The blue dog Democrats, man, he couldn't do it.
No, but even more than that, he also had the shock doctrine kind of effect of the financial crash, right? I mean, and we both talked about that earlier as well. How that was like a perfect moment for like a New Deal moment, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And why didn't that happen? Because he chose intentionally not for that to happen, because he chose intentionally to go the other direction, right?
Well, he chose to represent the people that represented him, right? Like it was he was the #1 recipient of all time from Wall Street, right? Like at the time of his campaign. So I mean, it's like we ask these questions, but we kind of know the answers, right? Like it's like we see, like, or at least we know the answers about what the incentives are, right? So it's like, and then that colors a very different picture than the rhetoric that's espoused by a lot of these individuals.
Yeah, and I think it's just important not to talk about, and that's why maybe also I got triggered a bit when you said Trump's incompetent, right? Because I think it's that argument is also quite prevalent on the Democratic side, where there's like, it's just because the Democrats, and that's also what I really thought, like growing up and like watching the Obama years, especially, like that it's because for some reason, and I know Glenn Greenwald was also talking about similar stuff about this, that it's because they don't have the capacity, or they don't have the power to do it, or there's some other reasons. There's like these endless amounts of excuses, right? That, oh, they didn't get enough power because of the left talked about defunding the police or whatever. What is it going to be now, right? But it's not because of incompetence that these happen. It's because of self-interest, right? And I'm sure that some elements is also incompetence, as I said before. But ultimately, especially when we look at the big picture and like the big policies that get through and so on, like these are intentional choices that are moved forward because they serve a very, very specific set of interests, right? And we should not diminish that in any way, I think.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Well,
Cool.
All right, man. I think this was a really good discussion, and I think we can wrap it up for now. And
yeah,
I think a lot of the topics we discussed today, we can, of course, expand on in future discussions. And I think this was a good preliminary discussion to kind of outline a lot of some of the basics about how we think about some of these things, and then of course a lot more detail to follow.
Yeah, I think this was maybe also quite clear, like the first time we did this kind of thing, and we just kind of jumped into it. So it's going to be something that develops as time goes on.
Exactly.
And yeah, I guess we can just say thank you all guys for watching. And yeah, see you next week or whenever we come out with something new.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Rasmus, it's been a pleasure, and talk to you soon.
Yeah, man. See you.
All right.